It was a hot evening in the summer of 1969 in New York, a summer when the city seemed to vibrate with raw energy. The streets, saturated with heat and noise, were the scene of demonstrations, rallies, and struggles. Young people, revolted, demanded change, justice, and equality. Slogans for civil rights echoed in the air, carried by voices full of fury and hope. This wind of revolt was blowing across America, from Washington to Harlem. But for Mike Tyson that evening, the city did not breathe like the others. The same city that was bustling with life seemed to have become foreign to him, full of contradictions. As he ran through the streets of Brooklyn, he perceived, beneath the excitement of the revolution, a much darker reality. At only 10 years old, Mike was still far from understanding the extent of this revolution that was brewing in his country, but he felt, deep in his gut, the atmosphere heavily charged with injustice. He was just a boy, innocent of many things, but aware enough to know that the color of his skin and that of his mother, Lorna, meant something very different in this world. Lorna had been her role model, a force of nature, a strong and courageous woman who had always known how to protect her children from the dangers of the streets. But that evening, a form of violence that he did not yet know would knock at the door of their world. Lorna was the pillar of their family, a pillar forged by suffering, but also by deep dignity. She had had no choice in life. She had grown up in a neighborhood where poverty, violence, and racism were omnipresent. But what was most precious to her was her love for her children, her desire to see them rise above what she herself had experienced. She had taught them to stand up straight, to never let themselves be defeated by prejudices and the hard blows of life. His eyes, black and deep as an ocean, had seen so many things. Broken promises, broken dreams, but also gestures of solidarity and resistance. That evening, she went to the grocery store, like every other day. She had nothing special to do except fill the family basket with what she could afford. It was a harmless gesture, banal even. But yet, in this neighborhood of Brooklyn, this gesture would put her on the path to a confrontation that would turn their lives upside down. Lorna walked quietly on the sidewalk, her basket in her hands, under the tired neon lights of the corner grocery store. The streets were full of noise, from lively chatter to crackling radios to car engines purring in the heat. She did not at first notice the officer following her at a certain distance. But when he got closer, his aggressive attitude left no doubt. It was Officer Johnson, a white police officer who regularly made rounds in the neighborhood. He was no stranger to Lorna. He was known for his dismissive manner and air of superiority, an attitude that many black residents in the neighborhood had come to know and avoid. But that evening, he would cross an invisible line that separated simple provocation from physical violence. "Hey, you stop!" shouted the officer, approaching suddenly. His tone was dry, authoritative, as if she had just committed a crime by simply walking around. Lorna turned around slowly, her face calm but already tense with habit of this kind of situation. She had learned never to respond to provocation, to keep calm, to maintain her dignity. But that evening, something in his eyes betrayed a silent fatigue, a deep weariness that came from too many years of humiliation and injustice. "I'm just going to the grocery store, sir." "Nothing more," she replied in a calm voice, her gaze falling on him, but avoiding direct confrontation. Officer Johnson, far from calming the situation, approached even closer, his gaze becoming menacing. "I'm telling you to stop," he growled, this time with more aggression. He observed her posture, as if judging her, as if her presence alone was a fault that she had to justify. It was more than just an interaction. It was a check. He wanted to mark his territory, to remind him that here, in this neighborhood, only he had the right to order. But Lorna, exhausted by years of oppression, did not give in. She didn't answer immediately. She lowered her head for a moment, the tension in her body palpable, like a cornered beast. She already knew she was condemned not for a crime, but for simply being black, female, and poor in a country that would never grant her complete humanity. Then, without warning, Officer Johnson lunged at her, grabbing her arm roughly. Lorna, who hadn't seen it coming, fell backwards, finding herself on her knees on the pavement, the basket shattered on the floor, eggs broken and vegetables crushed. She didn't even have time to straighten up before the officer burst into contemptuous laughter, thinking he had the right to treat a black woman like a mere object. "What do you think, huh? You're worthless," he sneered, looking at her disdainfully. Lorna, her face turned to the ground, felt a burning shame invade her. She had been publicly humiliated, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she existed, because she was the mother of Mike Tyson, a black boy, a boy whose society only had room for pain and bitterness. When Mike arrived on the scene, the image that presented itself to him was etched in his mind like an unreal scene, almost irreparable. Her mother, Lorna, was on the ground, her arms folded around her as if to protect herself from the brutality she had just received. His face, usually calm and wise, was now marked by physical pain, but even more by deep humiliation. His eyes, usually full of warmth and kindness, were now filled with confusion and shame. It was as if her mother's soul had been struck along with her body, as if the love and strength and dignity she had always embodied were suddenly swept away by the indiscriminate violence of a man who was intent on reminding her of her place. Mike froze for a moment, a choke in his throat, his legs like lead. He was used to seeing his mother face adversity. He had always seen her fight with fierce resilience. But there, seeing her lying on the pavement, a new feeling invaded his heart, a feeling he had never felt before: rage. It was not a cold anger, but a burning anger, a visceral anger, born from an injustice that he had observed with his own eyes. This policeman, this man dressed in a uniform supposed to symbolize law and justice, had just broken something much more precious than his mother's physical integrity. He had just broken her soul, that of a mother who had sacrificed everything she had to raise her children in a world that didn't want them, that of a community that was fighting for its survival in the face of systemic oppression. Mike was just a child, but this image, this precise moment, would change his life forever. Little did he know that this moment would mark the beginning of a profound transformation, that he would go from the fragility of a young boy to the determination of a man. His clenched fists swayed lightly at his sides, pounding with inexpressible anger. His gaze fell on the officer, and in a flash, a new strength was born within him. Pure rage. A rage he had never known. He felt like a part of himself, a part of his dignity, had been trampled on, and he wouldn't let it go. He approached the officer, each step heavy with an anger he could no longer contain. He hadn't even thought about what he was doing. It was instinctive, like an animal reaction. He slipped in front of the officer, staring at him, his face tight with determination, his fists clenched with an intensity that no one, including himself, could have anticipated. The officer looked up at him, a contemptuous smile playing on his lips. He felt superior, looking at this young boy as if he were nothing, a black child who had no place in this kind of confrontation. In his eyes, Mike was just a pawn, someone to be demeaned, another victim. He thought that this young boy was just one of those street children, incapable of understanding the truths of the world. But Mike, with an inner strength he didn't even know existed, stood there, straight, without hesitation. He had no fear, no apprehension. His fist, loaded with all the rage he had accumulated over the years in the face of oppression, met the police officer's face with such violence that time seemed to stand still.
The blow echoed through there like lightning striking the earth.
The force of the punch caused the officer to stagger, and he collapsed to the ground, his face bruised by the impact. Mike stood there panting, unaware of the significance of what he had just done. He had hit the man, sure, but more than that, he had hit the system. He had struck down injustice itself, this merciless structure which, every day, reduced entire lives to pain and submission. Around them, the witnesses, who until then had remained silent, frozen by the violent scene they had observed, began to react.
First, a murmur, a slight agitation.
Then louder voices, a few murmurs of approval. People, who had often been silent witnesses to similar violence, couldn't help but see something bigger in Mike's action. This wasn't just a hit on a police officer. It was an act of rebellion against years of racism, submission, and silence. It was a silent but powerful declaration that no person should ever accept being dehumanized, reduced to a mere obedient being. As the policeman, groggy and humiliated, tried to get up, screaming with rage and indignation, the noise in the street increased. Men, women, children, all who had come to witness the scene, began to gather around Mike. They did not come to fight. They were there because they knew. They knew this moment was not just an isolated act of violence. It was a cry of revolt, a cry shared by all those who were tired of seeing their lives broken, their rights violated. They didn't need words. They had experienced this all their lives. The police officer, injured and now besieged by the crowd, slowly got up, trying to shout attack. But his voice was lost in the growing din. The witnesses, those who witnessed so much violence but often remained silent, spoke out. Words of support began to circulate, murmurs, whispers of comfort and solidarity. Mike stood there, stoic, his fists still clenched, watching the officer, observing the scene unfolding around him. He had not sought to provoke the crowd, but the truth, the revolt against injustice, had taken over. The scene took on a magnitude that no one could have predicted. The days following the incident were marked by an intensity that neither of them could have anticipated. Lorna, in her pain and confusion, was devastated. She couldn't help but remember the tenderness with which she had raised Mike, this idea that violence should never be met with violence. She felt guilty, as if she had failed to teach him to protect himself from a society that was not ready to see him other than through the prism of fear and contempt. Horrified by the turn of events, she tried to make him understand that, although the officer's attack was a justifiable act of rebellion, he had not measured the consequences of his action. She lectured him, reproaching him for letting himself get carried away by anger. But despite his mother's love and concern, Mike knew he hadn't acted purely out of rage. He hadn't just hit a man in uniform. He had struck a symbol, a system, a collective oppression which continued to crush his people, their dignity and their humanity. It was a painful but necessary decision, an instinctive response to years of humiliation and injustice. The echoes of this courageous gesture spread like fire in the night. The Brooklyn community, already marked by decades of tensions with law enforcement, rose up in a collective cry. This cry, carried by those who had suffered in silence for a long time, resonated like an echo of hope and revolt. Officer Johnson, whose behavior had been one drop too many in an already frustrated bucket, quickly became the embodiment of police brutality. Local and national newspapers, sensitive to the power dynamics in place, began reporting on the incident, raising questions of systemic racism and police violence. What began as a street altercation transformed into a symbol of resistance against a society that unfairly repressed the most vulnerable. But this revolt was not without consequences. The prosecutor, under pressure from the authorities and in order to calm the growing tensions, demanded that Mike be tried for assault on a peace officer. The judicial machine was set in motion with glacial speed. Mike found himself facing a legal battle that would become much more than a simple case of self-defense. It would become a test of his character, his determination, and his faith in justice. The press went wild. Newspaper headlines about a young man's gratuitous violence against a police officer poorly masked the real underlying questions about institutionalized racism and abuse of power. Mike knew that this trial, although it affected him personally, also represented a fight for all those who had lived in the shadow of injustice, years of being victims of brutality without ever being able to defend themselves. But Mike didn't let it get him down. With each new round of the trial, he felt the pressure build. But he remembered what he was fighting for. It was not for his own freedom alone, but for his mother's, for his community, for all those who had been oppressed, ignored in society's silent anger. In his heart, he knew that this fight was not just legal. It was an act of resistance. He fought so that the voices of the invisible could finally be heard. On the day of the trial, the atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy. Defense lawyers highlighted the brutality of the police officer, the numerous testimonies of police violence in the same area, and the way society in general turned a blind eye to these abuses. They showed that the incident was just the latest in a long line of violence inflicted by officers like Johnson, systematic violence that dehumanized an entire community. But what really stood out that day was Mike's own pleading. When he stood up, alone in front of a captive audience and the impassive judge, he did not seek to justify his act with blind anger. On the contrary, with calm and serenity, he spoke of his mother's pain, the humiliation she had endured, the suffering of their community, and the frustration accumulated in the face of years of injustice. What I did was not for revenge, he said. It was not a gratuitous act. It was a response. A response to decades of violence. A response to a system that taught us to be silent and submit. His words, heavy with truth, struck the audience like a clap of thunder. It wasn't just a legal defense. It was a call to collective conscience. He explained that this act of revolt, although painful, had a deeper meaning, that it was a symbol for those who never had the courage or the means to defend themselves. When the verdict came, Mike's acquittal was met with a collective gasp in the courtroom. But for him, this legal victory was less important than the impact it would have on society. He understood at that moment that the real terrain of the struggle was not in the courthouses. It was in the streets, in the hearts and minds of the people. What he had done was not just resistance. It was a call for transformation. The real battle was not won only through trials and verdicts. It was gained in the way people understood, felt and acted in the face of injustice. He knew that that day, by raising his fist, he had not only won his own freedom. He had lit a flame in the heart of his community, a flame that would never go out. The fist he had raised, beyond his anger, had become a symbol of justice. A symbol of what it meant to stand against fear, against injustice, and against those who thought they could crush the dreams and lives of others.